All right, at the end of the last class, we were looking at archaeological finds that relate to the time of the Babylonian captivity. As I mentioned, the deportations to Babylon began in 605 BC, but they culminated dramatically with the fall of Jerusalem in 587, 586 BC. And that captivity lasted until the Babylonians were defeated by the Medes and the Persians in 539 BC. So that's the period of time we're talking about, because not long after the Medes and Persians defeated the Babylonians, then Cyrus allowed the Jews to return home. And the first item that we looked at in that time frame was the Babylonian administrative tablets that were discovered in 1930 or published in 1939 by Ernest Widener. And the Bible, I've mentioned before, it reveals that the Judean king Jehoiakim, you see here from 598 to 597, that he was taken captive by Nebuchadnezzar in 597. Nebuchadnezzar puts his man Zedekiah on the throne. He rules for 10 years. He rebels, and that then brings the Babylonians at the time they destroy Jerusalem. But Jehoiakim is taken to Babylon, and the item we looked at is the Babylonian administrative tablets, which give the quantity of rations that were given to foreign captives in Babylon. And here we have it. It refers to the rations given to Jehoiakim, king of Judah, and his 5 sons. I mean, it's just an amazing tie. Now, the other item of note, or at least the one I want to present from this same time frame, is known as the Nabonidus cylinder. And I'm also going to mention again the Babylonian Chronicle. But you may recall that in Daniel chapter 5, it indicates that Belshazzar, he was the last Babylonian king. He's the one ruling when the kingdom falls, when Babylon falls. And since other sources had said nothing about Belshazzar and presented Nabonidus as the last Babylonian king, critics claim that that was an error in the Bible, another mistake. You see these people they didn't know they were writing so long after the event, they were confused and all that. Okay, so they made claim that there was a mistake there. But in 1854, this is a good ways down the road, right? In 1854, a tiny inscribed clay cylinder, ultimately 4 copies were found, but this clay cylinder was found by J.E. Taylor at Ur, and it named Belshazzar as the eldest son of Nabonidus. Well, that gets very interesting, right? Well, I didn't know Belshazzar. Nobody talking about Belshazzar. We don't, well, here is this inscription that names him as Nabonidus' eldest son. And then the tablet known as the tablets that are the Babylonian Chronicle, which I mentioned before, those that were deciphered by that Assyriologist after World War II, Donald Wiseman, there at the British Museum. Well, those tablets, that portion of that chronicle describing the events of Nabonidus' rule from 555 to 539 BC, shows that Nabonidus, he entrusted the army and the kingship to Belshazzar during his lengthy absence. It was over 10 years. During his absence at faraway Tema in northern Arabia. Okay, so Belshazzar, he's the eldest son and he's the de facto king. He's been given the kingly responsibility during this time. And that sheds light on, in Daniel chapter 5, in verse 7 and 16 and 29, it has a clue regarding Belshazzar's status, because if you remember, he promises there to elevate those who can decipher the writing on the wall. He says he will elevate them to the 3rd position in the kingdom. And you could say, well, that's an odd thing. Why the 3rd position? Why not the 2nd position? Well, now you can see why. Because he's the de facto king, his father's the king, he's like a co-regent, the one in whom the responsibilities have been entrusted. And so the 3rd was the highest that was available. So we have that was found. Now, I want to move now from that. So that's the time of the Babylonian captivity. And then we have the return from exile. So the Medes and Persians defeat the Babylonians in 539, capture Babylon. And then not long after that is when Cyrus allows the Jews to return home. So we have that. They return back to Judah or Judea, and then down to roughly the ending of the Old Testament period in 430. So we're looking into the period roughly 539, 536, right in there, down to 430. And Ezra, chapter 1, verses 1 to 4, 2 Chronicles chapter 36, verses 22 and 23, it says that Cyrus, King Cyrus, when they defeated the Babylonians, that he allowed the Jews to return home from their exile. So the Babylonians take them into captivity. The Medes and Persians, under King Cyrus, they defeat the Babylonians. And then Scripture says that Cyrus allowed the Jews to go back home. And there were many people who said that was false, because they doubted that any 6th century BC ruler would do such a thing. That he would come in and he's got these people living here. He's going, yeah, you guys just go ahead and leave. And they doubted that, said that wouldn't happen. In 1879, Hormuzd Rassam, who's an Iranian archaeologist working under the British Museum, he discovered in Nineveh a clay cylinder that was inscribed at the direction of Cyrus. So this is the Cyrus cylinder. It's about 10 inches long, 5 inches wide, and it's written in the Akkadian language. And Cyrus, in this, he doesn't specifically mention Judah, but he there reports how he returned cult images, idols. He returned those things to their former sanctuaries. Okay, so when the Babylonians had come, they'd loot the temples and bring these things to Babylon. He returned those to the former sanctuaries. He established permanent sanctuaries for them. So some of the idols he returned, he built structures for them. And it also says there that he returned the former inhabitants to the lands of the various gods. So not only is he sending back the idols and things he'd taken, building structures for them, but he's letting the people return to the lands of those various gods. So Cyrus, he credits the god Marduk with selecting him and giving him the task of ruling the world. But you and I know that he's God's instrument. Even if he's oblivious to that fact, he's God's instrument in allowing Israel to return home. You see that in Isaiah chapter 44, verse 28 through 45, verse 6. But here we have, this is the policy of returning the people to their former lands. Again, confirmed, the Bible says this. People say the Bible's crazy, Bible's wrong. Then way down the road, what do you know? It looks like he actually let people return home. He did indeed. Now, in 2007, the Israeli archaeologist Eilat Mazar, I've mentioned her before, she died in 2021. She announced that her excavations that she was conducting just south of the Temple Mount, that she had uncovered a small section of a wall, the construction of which she dated to the time of Nehemiah. Okay, so she uncovers this section of wall and she says this wall is built during the time of Nehemiah. Now there are a number of archaeologists who concur. They say that's right. But some think, it's controversial. Some think that the wall may have been constructed more recently than that. So let me show you what this is. Here's the location of this wall. I'm just going to kind of gradually see. Here's the city of David, that tongue that comes down. There's the Temple Mount. And see, here's the Kidron Valley, and here is where this wall is. There's a large stone structure, this stepstone. Now I'm going to zoom into that, see with an aerial view that you'll see. So here is the view of Mazar's excavation. And here you have this step structure. You see kind of how it pinches in. Right here is the wall that she says was constructed in Nehemiah's time. And I'll just show you the complexity. You say, well, what's the controversy? when you've had a city that's that old and all kinds of stuff is built around, here is the chronological complexity here. You see the blue is from about 1000 BC. The gold is 10th to 6th century. And then the yellow is the 5th century. That's Nehemiah's wall right there. You see, but you see how hard it is to it's not like you just bop in and say, hey, so these things are complicated, but here is a close-up of that wall right there, the wall Nehemiah built. And I find that's just really cool. You know, that you could just actually sit here and have these things and locate such things. Now, the book of Nehemiah, it mentions repeatedly an opponent named Sanballat the Horonite. So if you read Nehemiah, you know that he's in there. He was the governor of Samaria at the time, and he's one of these guys who's hassling them and doesn't want them to be doing this. And the book of Nehemiah also mentions that Eliashib was the high priest at that time. And you see that in Nehemiah chapter 3, verse 1, verse 20, and chapter 13, verse 4. And it says that one of Eliashib, the high priest, one of his sons was named Johanan. Okay, so Eliashib is the high priest. He has a son named Johanan. Johanan is his name. And you see that in Nehemiah 12, 22 to 23. The longer form of Johanan is Jehohanan. We've been through that. Johanan, Jehohanan, and you know that's the case here because you have the longer form of the name, and Eliashib is his father. You see that in Ezra chapter 10, verse 6. So no question, this is the same person, Johanan or Johanan. Johanan or Jehohanan. Okay, it's hard to say these things. But that's the same guy. So we've got Eliashib the high priest, he's got his son, and we have Sanballat the Horonite. Now, in the early 20th century, so about a century ago, a little bit more, a trove of papyri, this is the plural of papyrus things they would write on, a trove of papyri written in Aramaic was uncovered at an unusual Jewish settlement at Elephantine in southern Egypt. Okay, so here's this Jewish settlement in Egypt, and we find this trove of writings in Aramaic on papyrus documents. And Papyrus 30, which dates to 407. So Nehemiah is around the middle of the 5th century, 445. So we're decades down the road. But in 407 BC, this is a letter from priests at Elephantine to Baghoi, who was then the governor of Judah. So these priests from this unusual Jewish community in Egypt are writing to the then governor of Judah, and they're writing to him and they want his permission to rebuild their temple of Yahweh that had been destroyed by Egyptian troops. Now you might be thinking, what are they doing having a temple of Yahweh down here, right in Elephantine? But be that as it may, they had, and it was destroyed, and they're writing back and they say, listen, we want your permission to rebuild this temple here. And they say that in the letter that they sent a letter to our Lord and to Jehohanan, the high priest, and his colleagues, the priests who are in Jerusalem. Okay, so Eliashib was the high priest decades earlier. He has a son, Jehohanan. And now they're writing decades later, and they're writing and mentioning the high priest Jehohanan. So obviously, his son has now become the high priest. And here we have it written just like that. And they say that to him. They write that. And Jehohanan, so he's the son who's now the high priest who's mentioned. And the priest also referred to a letter that they sent to Delaiah and Shelemiah, sons of Sanballat, governor of Samaria. So these are the sons of the Sanballat who had opposed Nehemiah. We have it here in external writings. So you can see people saying, now, these are like basically fictional characters. They're just throwing in these names and this kind. Well, that's not true. These are historical people. And how does the Bible know this? If you're saying, well, these things are made up centuries later and people don't know anything, man, they just get really lucky with all these names and details. Right? They just really do. So you have that. Now I want to look at the time of King Herod. Okay, King Herod, Herod the Great, he lives from about 72 BC down to 4 BC. Some people lately have tried to say, well, no, he died in 1 BC, but that's generally not accepted. Okay, good reasons for thinking he dies in 4 BC. Okay, so 72 to 4 BC. Now, Herod the Great, as you know, he ruled Judea at the time of Jesus' birth. He's the one who summoned the wise men or the magi after Christ's birth. He's the one who slaughtered the male children of Bethlehem when he realized that he'd been tricked by the wise men. You see that in Matthew chapter 2. Now, there are a lot of literary references to these figures, like Herod the Great and other people I'm going to talk about. Okay, they're referred to, Josephus. It's not a secret that they're historical characters, but what I'm looking at is archaeological finds that confirm these people. Artifacts, objects, not literature. And in 1970, Yaakov Meshurer published a limestone weight, probably from Jerusalem, that has a Greek inscription on it, and that inscription says, year 32 of King Herod, pious and friend of Caesar, inspector of markets, 3 minas. So here you have this, King Herod is indicated right here on this limestone weight. We have Herod's identification. And in 1988, Ursimant Zulanu Richards, she published a Greek inscription that was found in 3 fragments. The first fragment of this inscription was found around 1874. And this inscription, it's from a building. The building was probably in Delos, which is a tiny island in the Aegean Sea. The inscription was found elsewhere, but it's thought to have been to a building on Delos. And it says that Herod dedicated to the people. So this building he's dedicating, and here you see King Herod to the people of. And I don't know if the dots mean that that part was missing or what. But here we have another reference, an inscription instead of literature, pointing to the reality, the existence of King Herod. And in 1995, Alla Kushner Stein published a lead weight from Ashdod bearing the Greek inscription, in the time of King Herod, pious and friend of Caesar. So he was, Herod, he's an Idumean. Herod is somebody who's basically Rome's client to manage Israel. Right? He's big friend of Rome. And so that's who he is. But that's why you get pious and friend of Caesar, always said. There are several inscriptions from the people of Athens that I don't have pictures of to Herod. They've been found, and they describe him as a friend of Romans, the pious king and friend of the emperor, all of which is true. Okay, that's how he ruled for so long there. Now, Yigael Yadin's excavations of Masada. So he's excavating at Masada. That was the last holdout after the Jewish war. And so he excavates there in 63 to 65, and he uncovered some 13 broken wine jugs that had been imported. These wine jugs had been imported from Italy, and these ostraca. So remember, ostraca an ostracon is a broken piece of pottery. Ostraca is the plural. And these broken pieces of pottery often function as they write on them. And so here we have these ostraca are dated to 19 BC. Herod dies in 4 BC. And they're written in Latin, and they say, for Herod, king of the Jews. So Herod's living large. He's importing wine from Italy. Herod's obviously very, very rich. And you know that from all the projects that he engages in and all that kind of thing. But here we have another archaeological confirmation of this large New Testament character, Herod. And there he is. Now, in his authoritative book, Guide to Biblical Coins, I think it's in its 6th edition now. But David Hendon, he lists 22 different types of coins that were issued by King Herod and that bore his name in Greek, either saying of King Herod or simply saying King Herod. Okay, so you have by 20 different kinds, I simply mean different types of coins. Okay, not necessarily, they put different things on the coins. Here's an example. Of those coins, 4 of those were mint in Samaria. So you had a coin mint in Samaria and you had one in Jerusalem. Here's an example of a Herod coin that was minted in Samaria. And you see the designs and things are not always the same. And so he has 22 different styles of coins that have Greek inscriptions identifying. There are sometimes coins that they don't name the people. But here you have these, and they name him where it says either of King Herod or King Herod. And there's a nice example of that one there. Now, Josephus, he reports in his writings, literature, that Herod was buried at Herodium, which was this extravagant fortress and palace complex about 3 miles southeast of Bethlehem. And that site, it was first excavated in 1962 to 67 by Virgilio Corbo. But it wasn't until 2007 that the Israeli archaeologist Ehud Netzer, he discovered they'd been looking for his tomb. That's what they'd been looking for. And it's kind of funny. I had a diagram where it showed where it was. It's down on the side of the hill a bit. But they were looking for his tomb, and Ehud Netzer discovered it. Now, in 2013, there were some archaeologists that questioned whether that was actually his mausoleum, whether that was actually his tomb, because they thought it was too modest for such an egomaniac as Herod. But Netzer's conclusion is generally accepted as true, that this is in fact Herod's tomb. And here is a replica somebody has constructed of what that tomb would have looked like. So he's dead, there he is, and we discover Herod's tomb. And again, these people come to life. Now I want to look at, so he dies in 4 BC. Jesus is born before that. That's just an oddity of the people that began the calendar. There was a mistake made. I think there was Dionysius Exiguus, I think. I may be mixing that up. But whoever started the calendar wasn't aware. Jesus dies before, Jesus is born before Herod dies, right? And so he may be as early as 6 BC, but that's just an idea. So I'm going to go from when Herod dies 4 BC. Basically, I'm looking at Jesus now until his crucifixion, which I think is in 30. Some would put it at 33. Okay, so this is the time frame I want to be looking at now. And in the late 7th century, okay, so AD, so we're talking about in the late 600s AD, there's an Irish monk, a guy named Adamnan, and he produced a 3-volume work titled De Locis Sanctis, which is Latin for about holy places. So this is in the 600s. He writes this book, and it was based on information that he gathered from a monk named Archaeology, who traveled to the Holy Land. So this guy had gone and traveled all to the Holy Land, and we have Adamnan is writing a book, and he's basing it on what this guy discovers. But he makes clear, Adamnan makes clear that he questioned Archaeology closely. In other words, he's not saying, I just sat here and said whatever the guy told me. He questioned this person closely, and he checked what he told him against the resources that were available at that time in the 600s. So he's researching what he's being told to the best of his ability. And he makes that clear. And in that work, Adamnan reports that there were 2 large churches in the center of Nazareth. There are 2 large churches there, one of which is identifiable as the present-day Church of the Annunciation. So we understand that location. So he says that in the 600s, there are 2 large churches in Nazareth. One is identifiable with the present-day Church of the Annunciation. We know where that is. And the other church, which he calls the Church of the nutrition, meaning the church of the upbringing of Christ, he says that was near the church of the Annunciation, and he says it was built over vaults that contained a spring and the remains of 2 tombs. And he says that between those tombs, therefore under this other church, there was the house in which Jesus was raised. All right, so that's what this guy writing in the 600 says, based on this travel. Now, the Sisters of Nazareth Convent. All right, so we have the Church of the Annunciation. That's the one we know. But he says over here, there's this other church, the Church of the Nutrition. At the time, in the 600s, there's this Church of the Nutrition. And this church is built over these 2 tombs, a spring, and there is what is thought to be the boyhood home of Jesus. And so where is that church, that other church? Well, the Sisters of Nazareth Convent, it's maybe 100 yards from the Church of the Annunciation. Well, that qualifies as near, right? It may be 100 yards there. And some limited and amateur excavation had been done by the sisters at the convent in the 19th century and their workmen. And again, in 1936, there was some amateurish poking around done by one of the priests. But the first serious professional excavation at this particular site began with the Nazareth Archaeological Project in 2006. That was headed by the Cambridge-trained archaeologist, a man named Ken Dark. And he reported in an article published in 2015 in the Biblical Archaeology Review that his excavation of the cellar of the convent, right, which is 100 yards away, that qualifies as being near. He reports that his excavation of the cellar of the convent revealed precisely what had been described in De Locis Sanctus. That is, there was evidence of a large Byzantine church, right? We now have it, there's this convent now. But as he goes down there, he sees that, hey, there was a large Byzantine church. Byzantine means like from the 5th century up until the Crusader period. So when our guy's writing in the 600s, the church he's talking about is a Byzantine church. He goes down and he finds a large Byzantine church, which would have been the church that Adamnan was talking about. He finds that church, and he finds that it had been built over a chamber that housed 2 tombs and a spring. And between those 2 tombs, there was a 1st century Jewish home which was cut into the limestone hillside and completed with stone-built walls. So we dug out and we put walls there too. So exactly what had been said was there. And both the Byzantine church, which would have been there when that's the one Adamnan would have been referring to, and the later Crusader church, they were constructed with clear regard for that home. So whoever's building these churches is doing it in relation to that home, which is quite interesting. Now, Ken Dark, the archaeologist, he says, the excellent preservation of this rectilinear structure or house can be explained by its later history. Great efforts had been made to encompass the remains of this building within the vaulted cellars of both the Byzantine and Crusader churches so that it was thereafter protected. And so whoever's doing this has some idea that this place has some value. And here is the rock-cut doorway of that 1st century home. And Ken Dark says, in front of the doorway, a fragment of the original floor survives. And here's how he concludes his article in Biblical Archaeology Review. He says, at the Sisters of Nazareth Convent, there was evidence of a large Byzantine church with a spring and 2 tombs in its crypt. The 1st century house described at the beginning of this article, probably a courtyard house, stands between the 2 tombs. Both the tombs and the house were decorated with mosaics in the Byzantine period, suggesting that they were of special importance and possibly venerated. Only here have we evidence for all the characteristics that De Locus Sanctus ascribes to the Church of the Nutrition, including the house. Was this the house where Jesus grew up? It is impossible to say on archaeological grounds, right? I mean, you'd have to have a sign hanging in there that says Jesus lived here. All you can do is look and say this is a first century home, Jewish home, and here it is at that time. He says, on the other hand, there's no good archaeological reason why such an identification should be discounted. What we can say is that this building was probably where the Byzantine church builders believed Jesus had spent his childhood in Nazareth. So they thought that. And now you say, well, how reliable would that be? Well, as I've said, traditions like this that have religious importance tend to stick really well in memory. But can you prove that definitively? Of course not. Now, Herod the Great, he dies in 4 BC. And in his final will, he expresses his intention, what he wants. So he's got a large rulership that had been bestowed on him by Rome. He's the king of a significant area. And what he wants he expresses his intention that Archelaus, who was his oldest surviving son, that he be given the title king. That's what Herod wants. He wants Archelaus to be given the title king and to be put in charge of the territories of Samaria, Judea, and Idumea. So he says, Archelaus, make him king over these 3 areas. That's what he wants. And Archelaus' younger brother, Antipas, it's Herod's desire that he would be a tetrarch. Archelaus king, but Antipas to be a tetrarch, which is a lesser title, that he be tetrarch of Galilee and Perea. And then Philip II, who's Herod's son by another woman, that he was named tetrarch of Iturea and Trachonitis. Okay, 3 sons, king, tetrarch, tetrarch. That's his plan. And Augustus, since they're the ones who ultimately rule, the Romans control this, Augustus, he confirmed this 3-fold division of Herod's kingdom to his 3 sons. But he's not willing to give Archelaus the title king. He gives him the title ethnarch. Okay, so we've got 2 tetrarchs, now we've got ethnarch instead of king. And he says there, look, you have the prospect of becoming king if you prove yourself in that role. Then you'll be elevated to king. Well, he didn't do that. Okay? He didn't manage very well, and he was removed from power. Archelaus was removed from power in AD 6. All right? So he's gone, but his territories, and when that happened, his territories were then, those that he had ruled, they were annexed to the province of Syria, and then placed under the direct rule of a Roman prefect, a guy named Coponius. So that's where we are with I just want you to have a picture of the 3 sons and who they are. Now, Matthew chapter 2, verses 19 and 20, reports that after Herod died, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream in Egypt and told him to return to Israel. And Joseph does that, and then verse 22 of Matthew chapter 2 says, but when he heard that Archelaus was reigning in Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. Now, Archelaus also is probably alluded to in the parable of the minas in Luke chapter 19, verses 11 to 27. Okay, why am I going through all this? David Hendon, the guy who has the book on the biblical coins, he lists 6 types of coins that were issued by Herod Archelaus. And they're inscribed in Greek with the name Herod, and then they have various indications of the title ethnarch. Okay, so Archelaus is the only ethnarch. We got 2 tetrarchs. We've got Herod Archelaus, who's the ethnarch. And here's an example of one of those coins. So we have Herod mentioned, and you have ethnarch. It's front and back. And so there's one of, just one of these things you can touch. That these guys, these biblical, they're real people. They're real rulers. And they're doing this with these coins. Now, Herod Antipas, he ruled Galilee and Perea as the tetrarch. He ruled there until his death in AD 39. So Archelaus gets the boot in AD 6. But Antipas has a long run from after Herod's death in 4 BC. He stays in power until AD 39. Luke 23, verses 6 to 12, it reports that Herod, that means Herod Antipas. That's the Herod being talked about there. Herod Antipas reports that he ridiculed and mocked Jesus before sending him back to Pilate. Right? He runs Galilee. And so he sends him back to Pilate. Pilate finds out, he says, they become friends then. You know that story. But he earlier had imprisoned John the Baptist and had him beheaded at the request of Herodias' daughter. You see that in Matthew 14, Mark 6, Luke 9. And he's referred to in Scripture more technically as Herod the Tetrarch. You see that in Matthew 14:1, Luke 3:19, 9:7, and Acts 13:1. And as Herod Tetrarch of Galilee. That's in Luke chapter 3, verse 1. So this is who this person is. Now, Hendon lists 21 types of coins that Herod Antipas had published or printed or minted. And they're typically inscribed in Greek with "of Herod the Tetrarch." Okay, that's who this is. And here's an example of those coins. Coins of Herod Antipas. So this very guy who's sitting here mocking and ridiculing Jesus, you can just go grab one of the coins. You know, and I think about this all the time, that these coins, how close did these coins come to Jesus? You know, as they're circulating all through Jerusalem and all, how close did they come? You know, I would love to know some of these things. Now, Herod Philip II, he rules as Tetrarch of Iturea and Trachonitis down to AD 34, so not quite as long as Antipas. He rules till 34. Luke chapter 3, verses 1 and 2 says that he held that office when the word of God came to John the Baptist in the wilderness. So we have him indicated there. And Philip marries Herodias' daughter, Salome. He marries her. That's the one whose dance led to John's beheading. Okay, so all of these people who are there, just genuine, right? Real individuals. And Hendon lists 17 types of coins that were minted by Herod Philip. All but 4 of them are inscribed in Greek with Philip the Tetrarch, or simply with Philip. And here you have an example of those coins. So they, again, you know, circulating all these different coins. Were they touched? Were they in the pocket of some of the people that we know in Scripture? I just wonder about that, and I think it's cool. Now, Jesus is mentioned as teaching in the synagogue in Capernaum. Right, you see that in Mark chapter 1, verse 21, Luke chapter 4, 31 to 35, John 6, 59. There was a large limestone synagogue that was discovered in Capernaum, and it was thought to belong to the first century. For a good while, people thought that limestone synagogue there, that was the first century synagogue. But in the early 1970s, it was determined that no, that structure, that limestone synagogue there, that really dates from the 4th or 5th centuries. Okay, so way down the road from Jesus. But in 1975, excavators, they discovered black basalt walls under all 4 corners of that limestone synagogue, that 4th or 5th century synagogue. They see that under it has these black basalt walls, and further work reveals that those walls are 4 feet thick. They're 4 feet thick, which is much too thick for a private dwelling. And the associated pottery there demonstrates that the basalt structure was built in the 1st century. So now we've got something under this 4th or 5th century synagogue, this black basalt structure that is too thick to be a residence, and it's a 1st century structure. And you'll recall in Luke chapter 7, verses 1 to 5, that a centurion was praised for having built the synagogue in Capernaum. So we know that the synagogue's been built in Capernaum. Now here we find a first century structure right under the 4th or 5th century synagogue. And the underlying structure is the same size as the limestone structure, and it's laid out like that other later synagogue. And for these reasons and the tendency that exists to build religious sites on existing sites, those reasons have convinced many that the basalt structure is a first century synagogue over which that later synagogue was built. Okay, here's John McCrae, an archaeologist. He says, it is certainly the remains of the synagogue in which Jesus preached. Now, if you've been paying attention, people debate things, okay? So not everyone agrees with that. Some people say, well, I'm not convinced it is a synagogue, okay? Very good reasons for thinking that it is, and there are many people that believe that, just as I indicated there. All right, I have 2 minutes to go, so you're going to get something here. Let's see. All right, Matthew chapter 8, verses 14 to 15, Mark 1, 29 to 31, Luke 4, 38 and 39, report that Jesus healed Peter's mother-in-law, heals her mother-in-law while staying at Peter's house in Capernaum. That evening he healed the sick and demon-possessed that gathered at the door. And this is presumably where he healed the paralytic, the person who'd been lowered through the roof, as reported in Mark chapter 2, verses 1 to 12. Well, in 1968, Virgilio Corbo and Stanislao Lofreda, they began investigating a 5th century octagonal church located just 84 feet south of the synagogue there in Capernaum. During the Byzantine era, which includes the 5th century, octagonal churches often were built over what were considered holy sites. If they thought this was a holy site, a site of particular importance, they tended to build these kinds of churches there. And beneath this octagonal church was a 4th century church. Okay, so we have this 5th century church. Below it is a 4th century church. And beneath that 4th century church was a house dating to the mid-1st century. Okay, 50s. Right in that range, dating to the mid-1st centuries. And the walls of this house, they were narrow and they wouldn't support a masonry roof, meaning the roof would have been made of wooden branches that were covered with dirt, like the one in Mark chapter 2, verse 4, where they lowered the man through. So that's something. And the walls, the ceiling, and the floor of the central room of the house had been plastered in the 1st century, as was done with public rooms that were used for special purposes. And it's the only house known in Capernaum to have plastered walls. And the walls and floors had been replastered at least twice. Now, I'm overtime here. I see they're giving me mercy by not ringing that bell. But I'm going to stop there, Lord willing, next week. Thanks.